Now, there is this clear disconnect. We don't have to pretend like there isn't. And just to emphasize on that a little more, now the Kashmir dispute remains to be the oldest unresolved disagreement on the United Nations agenda. The United Nations Office of the United Nations High Commissioner released a report in 2018 and updated that report in 2019, listed extensively of the human rights violations ongoing within the region, which included civilian killings, excessive use of force, the continued use of pellet gun fires, cordon and search operations, the Public Safety Act, which allowed picking up and detaining people for up to 2 years without a fair trial. Now, all of these grave violations, and the United Nations itself has documented. What worth does this organization have if it is not able to take action against any of these violations?
Well, it's an excellent question which keeps on coming up, and that goes to the question that human rights promotion and protection doesn't get far without political will and international cooperation, which is the purpose of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the elaboration of International Human Rights Instrument and the whole construction of the UN human rights system. And it works very well in many instances. And it has been of revolutionary significance and has given people the courage to identify the wrongs being done to them and to fight for them in terms of binding rights and obligations. So it plays an important role, but it's a necessary but insufficient condition for fighting for human rights. What the Universal Declaration did was to, as I say, chart that path and establish a common standard of achievement. And we have all these instruments, but states are very schizophrenic. And I think Hassan pointed this out very well, to say that on the one hand, they like to get the credit, and to say that they are law-abiding, human rights respecting governments, on the other hand, is very hard for them. And it's a matter of political choice to act only in their self-interest and to guard their sovereignty. For example, the United Nations, budget for human rights is only 3.7%. It's very, very low, notwithstanding the fact that Article 1.3 of the UN Charter puts human rights very high on the international agenda by including it among the purposes and principles of the United Nations organization alongside international peace and security. So on the one hand, you have this lofty promises, which were pointed out, and it's correct. On the other hand, the implementation is weak. Part of the reason for that is that the United Nations itself is weak. The United Nations is weak because that's what member states want. They don't want it stronger than that. They don't want to give more than 3.7% of the UN regular budget, and they don't want to give more authority to the UN to promote and protect human rights.
All right. Mr. Sunga, I take that point. The United Nations as an institution is weak. The people who are responsible for strengthening it don't want it to be strengthened. But Ms. Naima heard what Ms. Naima Majur had to say. Do you think the essential aim, which was to make certain human rights a universal concern, an international concern, and then hold those parties that are persecuting minorities, that are persecuting groups of people responsible, that has failed?
Well, it has failed in some ways. And we've seen that writing things down on a piece of paper is not enough. One has to back the human rights promotion and protection, especially with serious violations of the kind we're talking about, which Naima was mentioning in Kashmir. We can talk about Palestine and other hotspots as well. Syria, you mentioned. And the framework of the UN collective security apparatus is to make sure that all sorts of strong measures, which are provided for in the UN Charter, including the deployment of military force, peace enforcement, can be brought to bear on such situations. Now, again, it comes down to the countries veering away from the universalistic claims of the UDHR and the dictates of international peace and security, which require international cooperation, and acting again in their own self-interest. Just a reality check, while we're talking about human rights and all countries celebrate the UDHR, which they should. It's very important that they do it. But by the same token, the UN Secretary General has just mentioned back in, I think it was 4th of October, that 65 countries haven't paid their dues to the UN for this year to the tune of almost $1.4 billion. 1 billion of that
Professor
is
Sunga, now you mentioned the funds earlier, to interrupt here, but this is an important point. You mentioned the funds earlier, and I wonder, why do you think is it that the United Nations funds are lacking in this regard? Is human rights not kept as a priority, even though what we hear from the most developed nations, from the most democratic nations, is that this is the core value that is enshrined in their constitution?
Well, we don't just have to talk about Western countries. We can talk about any government, and we don't just have to blame the West or any other part of the world, except that the Western countries do have more means at their disposal. So it's a question of putting your money where your mouth is, and that's why I like to talk about budget. If countries don't back up their promises with budgetary allocations, that means they fear human rights criticism. They don't want the human rights system to be too strong, and they'd like to see if they can use it for their own ends. That's nothing new. All through the Cold War, we saw the two main superpowers at each other's throats, continually accusing the other, but not looking at their own records. I think it's very important for all governments and peoples around the world to look in their own backyards. And in the case of Kashmir and Palestine, they need absolutely outside assistance through the United Nations Security Council and the collective security system, because this is serious violations that have been allowed to go on very long. I just want to make one last point, and that is that human rights are very, very much integral to international peace and security. If they are allowed to continue, we get all sorts of problems, terrorism and violence and such discontent that it becomes explosive. So I think it's, I very much enjoy this discussion, which is a very important one, because it's not just about celebrating the Universal Declaration, but hoping and working towards its implementation in practice, which is a big challenge.